I think I drove it back into the dealer to turn it in on the very last mile. So what's interesting about that story is that I think almost 90% of the miles that I drove on that car were in all electric mode. So I think sort of that was a great car and a great experience for me. The first real, electric plug-in electric vehicle that I had. But that's about the time. So that isn't to say that there's not a great place for plugins. And that was a great car. And my parents still have a Chevy Volt. But it occurred to me that the simplicity, kind of the elegance of the all electric platform was going to be the future. So my next step was I tried that out. I got an e-Golf and leased that one too. I drove it every day back and forth to work, 25 miles, each way. And really, really enjoyed it. I think that's still probably one of my favorite cars of all time. But it also was sort of, painfully clear to me the limitations that still existed. So it's a great practical kind of elegant solution to a car, but really the battery wasn't ready. So it's 100 miles, not enough range, no fast charging, right? Kind of only limited use. And that really sort of drew me in. How do we solve that problem? So today I'm the proud owner of a Tesla Model 3. I love it. I really have to compliment Tesla for what they've done in kind of advancing this industry. I think we've come a long way at solving some of the problems. The range is higher, charge time is better, but I think we're not all the way there. And so that's some of what we're going to talk about in this presentation. So that's my story. Hopefully I'll get to hear some of your stories at the end as well. So without further ado, let me jump in. So I'll start with a little background on Quantumscape. The company is based in San Jose. We have an office right across from the airport down there. In fact, we just leased a much bigger facility, 200,000 square foot facility, where we will build our first pilot manufacturing plant. We were founded back in 2010, so a little bit over 10 years old. The technology was spun out of research that was happening at Stanford by a student named Tim Holm and his advisor, Fritz Prinz. So they partnered up with an entrepreneur named Jagdeep Singh, who's done a number of technology companies here in Silicon Valley. And what's interesting about Quantumscape is that from the very beginning, the mission was really clear. Let's not just try to build kind of an incrementally better battery. Let's really go after the internal combustion engine. Can we make a battery that competes with the internal combustion engine and really enables mass market electric vehicles with no compromises? That was the goal. And of course, it wasn't easy. So I joined in 2012. And as Ben mentioned, I was a scientist working on electrolyte materials. So I was one of a handful of folks who helped develop our solid electrolyte that now is kind of the core piece of our technology. And we just kept our heads down, focused in the lab on trying to solve that problem. Things have changed a lot over the last couple of years, especially. So, we're no longer 20 people. We're now approaching 500 people. You may have heard that we became a public company just about a year ago, and that has helped provide the funding that we need to kind of finish the job and really to build the first factory that's going to scale up these batteries and hopefully put them into vehicles. So speaking of manufacturing, I think it's also nice to highlight our relationship with Volkswagen. We've had a long-standing partnership with them. They're, of course, one of the largest automakers in the world, one of the largest manufacturing companies in the world. We've been fortunate to have kind of built a collaboration with them over the last 8 or 9 years, in fact. And recently we've formed a joint venture to build our first full manufacturing facility that will be built in Germany, in fact. A couple other things that aren't on this slide that I think are interesting. You may have heard just this week, we announced a second partnership with another top 10 automaker. So we're starting to kind of really build some momentum there. And we recently hired a new head of manufacturing who comes from the Gigafactory. So this joint facility between Tesla and Panasonic up in Reno. So she worked for Panasonic and headed their manufacturing engineering there. So comes with great experience producing over 2 billion lithium ion cells per year at that facility to help us kind of scale up to the same level. So that's the company's background. So why solid state? What are we doing, and why should you care about it? So I think being in this talk today, I think we're probably all interested in EVs and sort of see this transformation coming. I think there's no question that the auto industry is going to be revolutionized, which is pretty exciting to think about. We see this in the statements from, I'd say, almost all the major automakers, but not just their public statements, also their commitments. So there's been financial commitments to build factories, to design new vehicle platforms, to place POs. And so I think this change is coming, which is fantastic. But it's also important to realize that we're just at the beginning. So especially for those of us here in the Bay Area, I like to joke that driving up and down 880 through Fremont, we're near the Tesla factory, all you see is Teslas, right? So it feels like we're further along maybe than we are. If you zoom out a little bit to the rest of the country or the world, it turns out that we still have a long ways to go. So just looking at the numbers from last year, I think only 3% of the 100 million cars that are produced every year were electrified. And I guess it's our view at Quantumscape that there's still work to be done on the battery, which I sort of alluded to before, to go the rest of the way. So at the end of the day, we got to compete with the internal combustion engine to make this kind of a real practical solution for everyone. And that means better energy density, in particular, faster charge times, long cycle life, safety. This is a really, really important one and a hot topic right now. Maybe some of you have been affected by recalls recently, and then lower costs. So to get out of this kind of premium segment and enable something that everyone can buy. And so it's our view that the solid state lithium metal approach, and I'll talk about what that means, is the key to kind of eliminating these compromises and going the rest of the way. So just graphically, this is kind of what that situation looks like here. If you imagine this parking lot of cars are all of the vehicles that are produced each year. We're still this little green corner down in the bottom left, and the goal is to find a way to get the rest of that parking lot. I think to do so, you really have to think about 5 different things, and those are listed on the right. And again, mass market adoption means competing with the incumbent, with the internal combustion engine. So our view is you need more energy, and in particular, that means more energy density. So you need to be able to fit more charge in the space that's allocated for the vehicle. So today we're seeing cars with over 300-mile range, which is great. But if we can store even more energy, we can either extend that range or we can make smaller vehicles, which is certainly useful as you think about city cars and other applications around the world. We need more power. And specifically, I think this means faster charge time. So those are very much related concepts. If you've driven an EV, I know many folks listening today have driven EVs. You're used to like the fast response when you step on the gas, on the pedal, and that is power. But it turns out that today we're still limited in our ability to recharge these cells. So maybe the state of the art is around 40 minutes to go for a kind of full charge. And you're competing with like a 10-minute stop at a gas station. So we need to find a way to do that faster. Of course, cost, we talked about this before. The real mass market cars throughout the world are going to be less than $30,000 total. Today, I think we're still really limited by the cost of the battery. Lifetime is important, needs to last the life of the car. And then safety, that's probably the most important of all. So this, what turns out to be sort of a reactive system of the traditional lithium ion system, could be improved. And so I'll talk about that. So I wanted to spend a few minutes looking at the structure of a lithium ion cell. So what I've done here, this graphic on the left, is kind of a zoomed in view of the basic unit of a lithium ion cell. And I don't want to, bore you with too many details, but to kind of explain how this works, you've got a few layers, one on top of the other. And the basic units are 2 electrodes and an insulating separator between them. So I'll point these out. In fact, maybe I can get a laser pointer. Let's see if this works. So on the bottom is, in this picture, is the cathode. And so this is a porous composite, and it's composed of these particles, which are a metal oxide. So you may have heard the terms NCA or NMC. These are metal oxide composites, and they are a host material for lithium ions. So we can fill them up basically with lithium, and that's how we store the charge. On the other side, we have the anode. This is very commonly graphite, maybe with a little bit of silicon. And it's also what we call a host material. So it basically has a crystal lattice structure, which is like a rack of shelves. And on those shelves, we also can store lithium ions. Between these, we have a separator. And it's important that this is electrically insulating. So we want to force the electrons to go outside the circuit. And that's how we power our device. So it's electrically insulating. It's a plastic material. We call it a polyolefin. Turns out that's very much like a trash bag. So it's kind of stretched thin and it's full of holes. And then throughout this whole system is flooded an organic liquid electrolyte. And that liquid electrolyte is the medium through which the lithium ions can travel back and forth between the anode and cathode. Turns out that liquid electrolyte is a flammable reactive material. So there's sort of very few materials that you can use that serve the right function here. And that's a reactive component. The whole system is capped with 2 metal foils, and these are what we call current collectors. This is how we get the electrons in and out of the battery. So that's the basic function. And if I refer back to kind of these key requirements, it turns out that, some part of this structure is limiting in each case. So we can kind of go one by one. The energy is ultimately limited by those host storage material. So you could kind of see they take up a lot of space and a lot of volume. It's almost like those racks where we store the lithium ions are too big, take up too much space. So if we could find a way to slim that down or even get rid of that host material entirely, we'd be able to store more energy per space and weight. Fast charging or power is limited by the speed with which we can get the ions into those host materials. So it's like you have entryway to your storage facility, but the door is too small. Okay, so if we could find a way to sort of change that situation, change the architecture, we could get faster charging. Cost is limited by 2 things: the materials that you have to use to put into this cell and the manufacturing processes to make those materials. So of course, if you could kind of get rid of some of the host material, the non-active material, you drive the cost down. Lifetime is limited by side reactions. What we'd like to do is just move the lithium ions back and forth over and over again, thousands of times with nothing else going on. In reality, what we have, especially on the anode side, are some reactions with at the surfaces of these materials. So that tends to limit the lifetime. And then safety is limited by this reactive organic electrolyte, which can serve as a fuel. So if we generate too much heat, if something goes wrong and we have an internal short circuit, it can actually catch fire. And that's one of the ways that we end up with these recalls. So, oops, I have to get rid of this. There we go. So now let me talk about the advantage of the lithium metal approach. This slide is actually not Quantumscape's. This is a BMW slide that they published in 2015, so just a couple of years ago. And I'll talk through kind of what this says. So on the bottom, what we have are a range of different cathode materials. And these are include sort of the conventional materials right in the middle. NCA is the material that's actually used in today's Teslas. Right next to it, NMC 811 is a very common material you'll find in many other electric vehicles. And then we have kind of all of the rest of the high energy cathodes that are being investigated today. And then each one of these curves represents a particular anode choice. And on the y-axis is the energy density that you can get practically from that system. And what you find is with today's anode, the graphite anode, you kind of hit this ceiling of a little over 200 watt hours per kilogram. If you introduce some silicon, which is this second curve, you can do a little bit better, but as you continue to improve the cathode, you have to continue to add more and more host material, more and more racks for storage of the lithium ions in the anode, and you can never really get beyond about 300 watt hours per kilogram. On the other hand, if you use lithium metal, pure metallic lithium metal, you effectively do away with all of that host material, and you can break free of that limitation and see as much as a 2x improvement in energy density. And it doesn't matter so much which cathode you choose, you're always going to do better with lithium metal. It's kind of considered to be the holy grail in the industry. And it's not, Quantumscape certainly is not the first to think of this. It's been a goal for 40 or more years, in fact. But one of the keys is that it's very difficult to make work. So because of lithium's properties, it turns out that you need a solid state separator to really get it to function without reacting, forming dendrites, and failing. So we'll talk more about that in a second. This is what it looks like if you can make that lithium metal anode work. So I copied the lithium ion structure again on the left, and then basically to scale, the solid state lithium metal system that Quantumscape is working on looks like these pictures here on the right. And so I'll start you with the center picture. This is what it looks like when we fabricate the cell in the factory. So we start with a cathode material that's actually very similar to conventional. So it can be based on NMC, nickel, manganese, cobalt. It can be based on lithium iron phosphate or some other chemistry. But on top of it, instead of that porous separator and a hosted anode structure, we just have a single sheet of solid electrolyte. So it's a fully dense solid that is impenetrable by any liquids or gases for that matter. On top, all we need is a current collector. So in this case, as you can see, there's basically no anode at all. It's pretty interesting structure. So to form the anode, we actually have to charge the cell up. So we build the cell and we do its very first charge, and in situ, this green, fully dense metallic lithium layer forms. Because we don't have the host structure, all those racks for storage of lithium ions, it ends up being significantly more dense than the conventional lithium ion system. We basically drawn it to scale here. It's between 30 and 40% more dense for the same cathode material. So that's obviously beneficial to energy. There's a few other advantages. Because we don't have to make an anode, we've eliminated the material that's required and the manufacturing cost for 1/3 of the whole system. So there's some benefits there to cost. It turns out that there's also benefits to rate. So I mentioned earlier that the rate limitation is often due to the lithium ions having to enter this host material. So now we've gotten rid of that host material and we have just a single interface over which we have to transfer lithium ions. And so if you make that interface efficient enough, low enough resistance, you can overcome some of the power challenge as well. So there's some other benefits to this. So most of the kind of innovation here is around two parts to the system: the ceramic electrolyte and the lithium metal anode that goes on top of it. It turns out that you can use almost any cathode with this design that you want. So I alluded to this earlier. You can take the highest energy cathodes that are available and make a cell that would be, fantastic for long range, for example, in a vehicle. But you can also use something else. So if lower cost is more important, you can take a cheaper cathode material, and you still get the benefits of higher energy density and better power. As cathode research evolves and new materials are discovered, you can also take advantage of those and sort of continue to evolve this platform. So let me show you what that looks like in terms of energy density. This is a chart of the gravimetric energy density. So that's the energy per mass, often plotted in watt hours per kilogram, versus the volumetric energy density. So this is the energy per space, watt hours per liter. And these are very conventional chemistries. You may have heard of them. I'll start in the bottom left. Lithium iron phosphate is interesting. It's a low cost material. Iron in particular is very abundant, very cheap, and it's also very stable. So it has really long cycle life. Tesla, among other companies, have talked a lot recently about starting to deploy this in future vehicles. The downside is that it's lower energy density. So it falls, kind of in the bottom left of this chart. Other chemistries further up to the right are more common in EVs today. So I mentioned NCA, that's nickel, cobalt, aluminum oxide. That's most common in Teslas with among the longest range of vehicles on the market. NMC is a very similar material, a little bit more stable, made of nickel, manganese, cobalt, and it's just a little bit worse in terms of energy density. The next generation, what we're going to see over the next few years, are based on very similar cathodes with a little bit of silicon added to the anode, and that gives you another bump in energy density up to the, say, 700 watt hour per liter range. So now again, if you take these particular cathodes requiring sort of no modifications, no major modifications, and use the solid state lithium metal approach, this is what you can see. So the low cost kind of long life LFP system can come up to the range of those other higher energy materials. And if you really want to kind of go for the maximum energy density, the lithium metal NMC system is about 1,000 watt hours per liter. So that's, a 50% improvement over today's state of the art. So let me come back to kind of these 5 key requirements and I guess explain how the lithium metal solid state separator addresses each one. So energy, of course, by getting rid of that host material, using the pure in situ plated lithium metal, we can increase the energy density no matter which cathode we choose. Charge and power, we can improve by getting rid of this bottleneck at the hosted anode surface. Life, we can improve because, again, some of those reactions taking place at the anode can be improved with a solid state, stable ceramic separator. Safety, really critically, is improved because we've taken out that liquid electrolyte and replaced it with something that is very, very stable. In fact, I didn't talk too much about this yet, but the way we make this ceramic separator is through a heat treatment process at very high temperature. So it's stable to over 1,000 degrees Celsius. So even in kind of the most extreme conditions, it's not going to react. And then cost can be improved because we actually have less material. We don't have to make the anode and the less manufacturing at the same time. So I thought it would be helpful to look at how this translates to an actual system. So on this chart, there's lots of numbers. I can just walk you through it kind of one column at a time. If we start with the left column, this is an example of a state-of-the-art EV today. This is like the Tesla Model 3, so sort of similar numbers. The pack size is roughly 80 kilowatt hours. So watt hour is that unit of energy. So 1,000 of those is a kilowatt hour. Translated to the full pack, it takes up 335 liters. It weighs about 1,000 pounds, a little over 1,000 pounds, or 478 kilograms. Can drive 350 miles roughly, and that's with really good engineering of the system. Charge time, it says 30 minutes here. I think more like 40 minutes is more what we see. And then of course still has this reactive liquid electrolyte. If we take the same basic system design, but we replace it and use a solid state lithium anode, there's two things we can do. We can either maintain the pack size, so still 80 kilowatt hours, but ultimately have less space taken up by the battery. So we can cut down from 335 liters to 182, have less weight, and at least the same range. I think it's probably worth highlighting that with less mass, you tend to have better efficiency. So maybe you get a few more miles range, and then half the charge time. So 15-minute charge from 0 to 80% with better overall safety. Or you can take advantage of the improved energy density and actually build in a bigger pack. So let's say instead of 80 kilowatt hour pack, we now have 150 kilowatt hour pack in the same volume, about the same mass, maybe a little over 1,000 pounds. And instead of 350 miles, maybe you can drive 650 miles. In doing that, you still have the fast charge and you still have the safety advantage. So that is what Quantumscape is trying to do. Quickly, let's take a look at some of Quantumscape's progress. On the left here is actually a picture of the solid state separator that we've developed. So this is one of the key innovations and had took the better part of a decade, I think, to develop. It's a thin sheet of ceramic. It's flexible, as you can see, so you can sort of bend it with your fingers like that. When we build it into a cell, it's going to look like this picture in the middle. So this is one of our early prototypes. It's about the size of a deck of playing cards, so maybe a little bit bigger than your phone. And that's a single layer device. So one of the first kind of prototypes that we made. And today what Quantumscape is focused on is scaling that up into full commercial form factor, which means multiple layers. And this is an example here on the right. I've got a little bit of data just to sort of show you how the system performs. This is a cycle life chart for these solid state lithium metal batteries. And what we're showing here is the retained energy versus the number of full cycles that we do. And for reference, what we've done is show you the expected total number of miles that you might get with this system. And the assumption here is that it's a BEV, so a full electric vehicle with about a 300-mile range. So each cycle represents 300 miles of driving. So we think the commercial target is about 800 full cycles, and that translates to 240,000 miles. So, pretty long life for the car. And the data here that you see is for single layer cells. Through 800 cycles, we've retained a little bit over 90% of the initial energy, which is exceeding the target. And then these cells are continuing to cycle, so may do as many as 500,000 miles. So it's a very stable system with few side reactions, which I think is really important. So that's cycle life. I mentioned fast charge. I think it's equally important that with the high energy system, we can also charge it quickly. So here is some data that shows how the solid state system charges. For reference, I have this gray curve, and this shows the rate of increase of the charge versus time. So this is an example from a state-of-the-art BEV just from the last year or two. And what you see is going from 0% charge to 80% charge takes 35 to 40 minutes. There's typically this slowing of the rate of increase as you go. And that's because you're approaching the highest voltage, what we call the ceiling voltage for the cell, which is where everything is more unstable. And so we have to kind of slow that rate down. With a solid state lithium metal system, for the reasons that I talked about before, you can do this a little bit faster. So the Quantumscape cell is charging in about 12 to 13 minutes here, again to 80%. And then it also sort of slows down, but finishes maybe twice as fast. And I think the last data slide that I wanted to show is this one. So this, I think refers to the safety point. This is a material level test. And so what we're doing here is measuring the heat that is either generated or absorbed due to reaction between different components. So I can kind of explain this one at a time. If you look at the green curve, we've taken metallic lithium and we've put it in contact with a standard liquid electrolyte. And what we do is we increase the temperature looking for signs of reaction. And if you see kind of a drop on this chart, that's what we call an exotherm, or the release of heat. And we can measure that very precisely. So in this case, around 170 degrees Celsius, there's a huge reaction between lithium metal and a standard liquid electrolyte. And this is one of the reasons why we've had battery fires out in the field. By contrast, if you take Quantumscape's solid state separator and you do the exact same test with the same materials, the same amounts of materials, you heat this system up, instead of seeing heat released due to reaction, you actually see a little bit of heat absorbed. This is the melting of lithium. It happens at about 180 degrees Celsius, and then nothing else happens. So there's no reaction here. So it's very, very stable material. And fundamentally, I think that's the key to improve stability of the whole system. I wanted to just touch on cost quickly and not get into too many details, but Quantumscape's internal analysis shows that by eliminating the host materials for the anode and the manufacturing, there's a whole manufacturing line that's required to make a traditional anode. By getting rid of that, because it's kind of an in situ generated anode in our case, we can reduce the overall cell cost by between 15 and 20%. So the cathode is basically the same. Instead of the conventional electrolyte, we have to make our solid electrolyte, which has some differences, but all in, it's a little bit of a cheaper system with, of course, the other advantages. Talk about Volkswagen for a minute here. As I mentioned earlier, we formed a 50-50 joint venture, like an independent company with Volkswagen just a couple of years ago. And through this JV, we will build our first factory. So we're really excited about that. The factory is going to be based in Germany. Before that factory comes online, we'll have a what we call a pilot manufacturing facility based here in San Jose. And that will allow us to kind of learn the processes and start to develop them for scale. So that part's already underway. But we've got this planned facility, hope to have it come online around 2025, which will be sized similar to the Gigafactory that Tesla has up in Reno. So roughly 20 gigawatt hours. So, Volkswagen is a really terrific partner for us because of their experience and their size in manufacturing. So in 2020, they produced, as you see here, 9 million total vehicles. And their commitment to electrification is, I think, as strong as anyone. So they've announced plans to introduce 70 different electric models and 25 million vehicles by the end of this decade. So that's going to be a really, really exciting transformation. And it's Quantumscape's goal to get our batteries into some of these vehicles in the second half of the decade. And then just, my last slide here just kind of talks through the stages of where we are and where we're trying to go. Right now, we're really still in engineering mode, so relatively small scale, making prototypes, working out kind of the remaining kinks in this system and preparing for manufacturing. So we're going to build what we call the QS0 pre-pilot production line in San Jose with the new building that we've just leased. And this one will be capable of making a few 100,000 cells per year. And that sounds like a lot, or it sounded like a lot to me when we first started talking about it. But to really get where we want to go, we need to be making literally billions of cells per year. So it's a pretty large undertaking. That will first happen in what we call QS1, our very first manufacturing plant. Should come online in the middle of this decade through our partnership with Volkswagen. So that's our story. And, I wanted to end there and open it up to whatever questions that you have.
Hey, this is Ben. Before we open it up for questions, I wanted to thank Will, first of all, for a great presentation and some nice charts. And wanted to mention for those who joined the meeting late that this meeting is being recorded. So that's all I've got to say for right now. Go ahead, and if you have a question, go ahead and unmute yourself.
I wanted to ask, it sounds like this will not be in cars until probably maybe the middle of this decade, or is that what you were saying, Will?
Yeah, that's about right.
Okay.
It turns out that regardless of the particular technology, whether it's traditional lithium ion or solid state, it's a pretty capital intensive business. You got to buy large tools. They have significant lead times. So what we hope is to have test vehicles on the road, relatively smaller volumes before the middle of this decade. But I think it's going to be until 2025 that, you and I get to drive around in them.
Okay. I wanted to find out if we could talk further later, because we just produced a feature film called Lead the Way, where we have solar powered EVs in the film. What we want to do in the sequel, which we hopefully will be producing within the next few years, is a whole city that uses solid state batteries, okay, so powered by the sun, that runs a city and vehicles in the city that run on the sun. So I'm very much interested. I want to make it very realistic, and maybe we can even have a prototypes, in the film. So
yeah, please
let's talk about it.
Reach out to me afterward. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I'll put my my email in the chat. Okay.
Sounds good. Yeah, thank you.
So I have a question. My fundamental question about solid state batteries is that ions are molecules. How do molecules get through a solid separator?
I love that question. That's a great question. Yeah, I didn't get into that level of detail here. But it turns out that there are solid conductors of lithium ions that are just as fast as liquids. So it seems hard to believe. It's a different mechanism of ion transfer. So through a liquid, you're actually kind of shuttling ions. They just literally flow through the liquid. And in a solid, it's different. They have to kind of hop from site to site within a crystal structure. But there are solids that are truly, 100% dense solids that conduct lithium ions very well.
So it's 100% dense, except it has holes in it that the ions can go into.
Well, no holes. I mean, not in the traditional sense. These are sites within a crystal lattice. So like at the nanometer length scale, where lithium sits, in that molecule. And through vacancies, lithium can hop from one spot to the next. If that
All right,
makes
so
sense.
word vacancy is better than hole then. Not hole like drilling, but
Yeah,
it's
really
space.
small holes is the way to think about that, I think.
Okay. And the speed of that transfer is as quick as the ions flowing through the liquid?
That's right. So there's not very many solids that can do that. There's a small number, but basically on the same time scale as a liquid. And that's required.
Okay.
You need, in order to have the resistance of the cell be low enough to meet the needs of like an electric vehicle, that's a requirement.
The other question, second question that I had from your presentation is you talked about growing the lithium anode in situ. What is that grown from? It doesn't come out of ceramic, I presume, or can you explain that?
Yeah, sure. That's also a great question. So it turns out that today's standard cathode materials are fabricated with lithium in them. So all cathode materials are made this way, or at least the ones that go into lithium ion cells. So for example, if we take the most common material, NMC, nickel, manganese, cobalt, it's already lithiated. Okay, so it has all the lithium that the battery will ever need in the cathode before you even make the cell. And so we use the same principle. So when we charge the cell up for the first time, those lithium ions come out of that host NMC material. They move through the separator and they plate on the anode. Does that make sense?
Oh. May I ask a question?
Please.
So is there going to be a lot of expansion contraction because of this solid state? And what does that mean in design for heat transfer away from the pouch? How crucial is it going to be, and what kind of spatial considerations do you have to look at, or do you have that down now?
Yeah, there's like more great questions. These are sophisticated questions. So the answer is yes. I think fundamentally there's no way to avoid the fact that that unit cell, the stack itself, has to increase as we plate, because you saw the picture. We go from literally no, that's not an exaggeration, no lithium metal in that discharged state as manufactured, and then we plate between 20 and 30 microns of lithium on each layer. So you have to accommodate that that thickness change. And so this is one of the main focuses of a whole team of engineers that we have. How do you do that, to survive the whole life of the cell in the vehicle cost effectively? So I can't, go into the details of how we do it. But we think that problem is solvable.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So does this work only in the pouch format then? If you had a whole bunch of layers in a cylinder, would it not work because of that expansion?
Yeah, so we don't think that a cylindrical cell is the way to go with this chemistry for the reason you just highlighted. It doesn't necessarily have to be in a pouch, but it will be in a prismatic format. So it turns out that, outside of Tesla, virtually, let's just say most of the other manufacturers are using prismatic cells anyway. So that's kind of the direction that we are going.
So I'm not sure how this question and answer thing's going, so I'm just going to speak up. I don't see any hand raised or anything. Hi, I'm Beverly Deschaux. I'm the president of the Electric Auto Association, California Central Coast. And great presentation, geeky enough to get your point across, but not so geeky that you lost us ungeeks. or at least until these questioners start, these questions are coming in. My question are two things. One, the biggest hassles that we get from the non-EV crowd is about cobalt and about battery recycling.
Sure.
Want to speak to those two things? Are we ever going to get rid of cobalt? Because I mean, I understand the politics of it, you know, that there's really only a very small percentage in the battery, and that really there are only a very small percentage of the operations that are using child labor with the ripped up t-shirts, digging by hand, you know, those images that the oil industry is using to convince even the staunchest of environmentalists. So that's
Yeah, great question. I'm glad you asked that. So here's what I can say. I think for sure there's a path out of cobalt. And I think that it may happen even within the next decade. So right now, cobalt is really useful for the cycle life of these cathode materials. It just turns out that by putting cobalt in the structure of the cathode, it's more stable. And so it still gets used for that reason. The amount is continually decreasing, which I think is good. There's a lot of interest in getting rid of it. There's these major ethical considerations. It's also expensive. So it's the most expensive component of the whole cell. So right now it's well less than 10% of just the cathode, which means it's like less than 6 or 7% of the whole cell. And there's certainly a path to bring that lower. So one of the ways, without going too much deeper, one of the ways to do that is with the lithium iron phosphate cathode. So, you know, Tesla has been leading the charge on this. There's a lot of companies in China who are using lithium iron phosphate. So I think there's growing interest in that material. No cobalt at all. Abundant and cheap materials that I think are easily sourced and ultimately cheaper. So it's been maybe slow to be introduced because the energy density is worse, but that's one thing that our approach could help solve. So yes, I think that it's coming.
and recycling.
And recycling. Yeah, so there's a lot of activity actually recently in terms of battery recycling, which I think is great. I'm glad we're talking about it now rather than waiting until this industry gets bigger. So, you know, without going into lots of detail about the companies who are doing it, there's some like right here in the US who are leading the charge. Battery materials are very recyclable, which is great news. And I think it's likely that it will end up being cheaper to recycle and reuse the basic components than it will be to mine them out of the ground. I think that may come within the next 10 years. So to me, that's really, really promising.
Great, thank you.
Hey, this is Ben again. We still have a few minutes left for questions, and I've been letting it go freeform so far, but I'm going to suggest, in order to try and give everybody a chance, that I'm going to ask, if you want to ask a question, if you could raise your hand in the Zoom meeting. You know, there's a thing down at the bottom. If you could raise your hand, and then I will call on people who have their hands raised. Okay, all right. So I see Richard has a hand raised, and okay, and Many has all right. So I think Many had his up first. So I will, Many, if you could unmute yourself and then go ahead.
Yeah, my question is, so there's a Chinese EV company called NIO, and they do battery swapping. But I'm wondering what your opinion is on that, because that might like weaken the overall like car's durability.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think this has been a debate on this topic for many, many years. You know, there was a company, Better Place, over a decade ago who was looking into this approach. You know, my feeling is that this comes down to the cyclability, the cycle life of the battery chemistry itself. And I think if that issue can be solved, I guess there's two factors. Let me back up. So if you can charge quickly, I think this problem goes away. Maybe that's the place to focus. right? So today, this 40-minute limitation can be a major one for people, right? Like you're used to just driving into the gas station, in and out, and it's less than 10 minutes. I think we need to approach those times. And if you can approach those times, I don't see any need for swapping the battery. So that's probably the way to think about it. That's what we are trying to do. Today, lithium ion batteries are slowly improving here, but I think there's still a big gap just because of the material limitations. But with this solid state approach that we've taken, I think we can, do 12 minutes today, and with some steady improvements, hopefully over the years, then we're right in line with a gas fill up.
Okay.
Hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I think Richard is next. Richard, please go ahead.
Hi there. We're thinking of buying an EV next year. And now the question I'm thinking of, should we wait until the solid state ones come out? And my second question is, I cannot drive a SUV or small car because the suspension is just too hard on my back. I look for larger cars. I'm curious if Volkswagen, when they come up with a solid state battery, and they come out with their model, are they going to have it on multiple models, multiple frame sizes, or is it just going to be a small little thing? So 2 questions: what models is the VW going to have this solid state battery in? And should I buy now, or should I wait till the solid state comes out? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. Hey, I personally wouldn't recommend waiting. I guess I told you my story. I'm on my 5th EV, I think, and they keep getting better and they keep getting more interesting. And I think already today, you can find something, hopefully that meets your needs. Over the next 2-3 years, we're going to see a whole lot of new models. So whatever size, you're looking for, I guess you'll find it. In terms of our solid state technology, for sure, the goal for us is to, expand into as many vehicles as we can, because we're trying to make these better and reduce the compromises that people have to make. That's the whole goal. I don't know which vehicle will be deployed in first, so you'll have to stay tuned and find out.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. So let's see. I'm gonna call on. Sorry, Colin, or I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. Colin Gould. I think you're next. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. Great presentation. Appreciate it. As a Model 3 owner also, what do you think your comparisons are to the Tesla 4680 battery coming along, both in charge time as well as the release time frame? I think it might be a few years earlier than the Quantumscape.
Yeah, so I don't want to comment too much, speculate too much on the 4680. I mean, I obviously am aware working on, and they're trying to release that, I think, through their Austin facility, if I'm not wrong. I think they're still in the middle of working out the kinks there. So when they actually get it released, I don't know. Obviously that has to come from them.
Okay.
The basics of the improvements, I think, that I talked about, you should still see with our technology. They've made some great strides in reducing kind of maybe the peripherals, the terminals and the current collectors. They've really done some great engineering there, which helps get the cell level energy density numbers up. But all that stuff is still kind of applicable to a solid state lithium metal approach. So you'd really just kind of always keep this like 30% advantage, with what we're doing. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, I think that there's sort of a similar follow-up on the Toyota SSB research. They've been kind of quiet and resistant to BEV so far, but they say they have a solid state battery coming, but I think you guys are hopefully first. Are they really have something in the back pocket, or are they just sort of hedging and waiting, or?
You can never tell. We spend a lot of time, trying to figure that out ourselves, obviously. They are well funded. They take batteries very seriously. They've got a big program. We know a lot of the folks who are doing research over there, but they also keep it to themselves. So we'll see. I think for me personally, I'd love it if they're successful too. I think this is a huge, opportunity. 100 million cars a year, right? That we need to figure out how to electrify. So the competition is good, and we'll see when they actually come to market.
All right. It is 11 o'clock, but I think we probably have time for one more question. I see Tina Juarez has her hand up. Would you like to speak? I think you're muted.
My name is Ko, not Tina. That's just for the website. And the big elephants in the room for me are the words OEM and form factor. So I have a design where reluctantly the 4680s will will be perfect in terms of fit. The square shape of a prismatic, it becomes non-working design. So I'm really interested in your lowering the size, if you can get, if you need less size. But the OEM is the big issue. It's hard if you have an older EV and to get new batteries. I've gone through 3 used battery packs that just, the batteries couldn't do it. So
Okay.
I'm hoping
Yeah.
to work on the OEM solution, like kill it.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for your comments. So you're absolutely right that, because there's a few different form factors for batteries, you can't necessarily swap them easily. You really do have to design a pack like for a particular cell type. There are some real advantages to what we call the prismatic cells. They pack better, so the efficiency of packing, there's less wasted space when you put like kind of rectangles one on top of the other, as opposed to cylinders. With cylinders, you always have some space in between. So there's some advantages there, but there's lots of other trade-offs that I won't go into around the mechanics and the thermals, et cetera. So we may not be able to go into sort of every vehicle as a replacement. I think the way this will likely go is that a vehicle will be designed, purpose designed for a particular cell, and that cell should last the life of the vehicle. That's kind of what we're trying to do.
The hexagon is a beautiful shape.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Very elegant, fits, good packing factor.
Yeah. Will, could you perhaps explain what prismatic means in the sense that you're using it here?
Yeah, sure. That's a conventional term, so I apologize if that didn't make sense. Basically, it just refers to like the shape. Square sides, kind of a flat rectangle with, a little bit narrower thickness. And that's what we call prismatic. So there's 2 basic types. There's cylindrical or prismatic. And that's kind of the world of EV batteries. And
Okay.
because of our ceramic solid separator, it doesn't wind the same way. So a cylindrical battery is actually wound up. It's those layers that I showed, and there are literal winders that just kind of zip them up, and then they fit into a little round can. And in our case, we will stack them, kind of one layer on top of the other, and that is a different shape.
Okay, great. Thank you. So, Will, I do want to thank you for being here today, and thank Quantumscape for making this possible. And the recording should be posted in a day or 2. I'll email out the location to everybody who registered for the event on the Drive Electric Week website. Or if for some reason, if you don't get it, you can email me directly, benwhite@sunnyvista.net. I'll type that into the chat. So I think that wraps it up. I'm going to stop the recording now. Thank you again.